Despite the immense advances in tank technology and theory during World War II, which made it a conflict of movement and speed, siege warfare remained a critical element of the war. From Leningrad and Stalingrad to Bordeaux and Dunkirk, great sieges took place during the war, and tanks were an ineffective way of overwhelming urban defenders in many cases. Artillery was typically massed and used to bombard besieged cities into submission, and Germany took this one step further with the development of the Karl Gerät, a colossal 600mm self-propelled gun. The Germans took great interest in constructing superweapons with great destructive potential and combat capability, collectively known as Wunderwaffen, or miracle weapons. For instance, the V-2 rocket was a large, long-range missile that could inflict massive damage onto cities to cripple enemy morale and industry. Also, the Schwer Gustav was an 800mm railway cannon that could easily destroy buildings in one blast. The thinking was that weapons of great size and destruction would be able to win the war even if constructed in small numbers. Still, large Wunderwaffen consumed an immense amount of resources and presented themselves as large targets for Allied air attacks. Since 1933, the German government knew that war with France was inevitable if they were to achieve their goal of domination over Europe. Particularly important for Germany was expanding into Poland to retake the land they had lost after the Treaty of Versailles and to obtain Lebensraum, or living space, for the German people. War with Poland was synonymous with war with France due to the alliance between the countries. The problem facing Germany was the extensive fortifications France had constructed along its border with Germany, called the Maginot Line. The French had multiple layers of fortifications, each bunker with multiple meters of concrete protection. The German military command was uncertain that they could defeat France because of this. In response, the Karl Gerät was developed, a self-propelled siege gun with a 600mm gun that was designed to break through the concrete French bunkers and allow the infantry and tanks to move into France. The concept of the Karl Gerät came about in 1937. The machine was named after an artillery commander named Karl Becker, who was heavily involved in its development. At first, designers planned to create a large caliber gun that would be towed by multiple tracked vehicles, but this arrangement proved to be laborious, consumed too much manpower and resources, and put the weapon in a vulnerable position due to the time it took. Instead, the Karl Gerät would be completely self-powered, giving it more flexibility on the battlefield. The chassis was derived from a railway gun, and the tracks were long and wide to minimize the amount of pressure the 124-ton vehicle exerted onto the ground. A massive Daimler-Benz 580 horsepower 12-cylinder engine was used to propel the Karl Gerät to a maximum speed of 10 km per hour. But the off-road terrain that it often had to travel on rendered it even slower, with a maximum speed usually achieved at 5 km per hour. The Karl Gerät's range was also problematic. Early versions had a range of 42 kilometers, and later versions, with a more efficient engine, had a range of 60 kilometers. As a result, the Karl Gerät used its engine only for small distance maneuvers or for adjusting its aim. The Karl Gerät's mass rendered it incredibly inefficient, so the machine was disassembled for long-range movements. It was also impossible for it to traverse across bridges. It was disassembled, transported by rail, and assembled at the firing location because of this. Its planned path of movement had to be planned ahead of time so that any bumps or divots in the terrain could be leveled. With a power-to-weight ratio of only 4.2, it could not traverse across rough terrain easily. It was restricted from moving across soft terrain due to the risk of sinking and being stuck in the ground. In addition, moving across soft or uneven terrain could cause the tracks to fall off. The Karl Gerät's gun is what makes it stand out as one of the strangest and most destructive weapons of the war. Due to the size and mass of the shells, 2 or 3 modified Panzer IV chassis were required to transport the munitions on any mission. Each modified transport could carry 4 1,700-kilogram shells. In addition, the vehicle required an accompanying 35-ton crane to haul the shells from the transport vehicles into the Karl Gerät for firing. 22 Panzer IVs were converted to help carry ammunition. A large chassis and baseplate were also required to support its weight and tremendous recoil. The massive recoil made it necessary for the crew to re-aim the gun after each shot, and this is why it was so important for the machine to be self-powered. The gun could elevate from 55 degrees to 70 degrees, or 4 degrees to either left or right, but this made the reloading procedure rather awkward. No shells were stored on the Karl Gerät itself, and they had to be transferred from the ammunition transport vehicles into a loading bed behind the gun breech. They were then loaded in. In between each shot, the gun had to be lowered to a horizontal level so that it could be reloaded, and then realigned to the proper angle again. Trials in 1939 proved that the Karl Gerät would be incredibly vulnerable in combat. First, its range of 4.3 kilometers meant that it could be in range of smaller caliber artillery or enemy aircraft close to the front. The immense amount of time required to assemble and disassemble the weapon meant that the weapon could not be quickly evacuated in the event of an enemy breakthrough. In the event of an enemy breakthrough, it had no armor or defensive armament of any kind besides the crew's own personal weapons. Likewise, they were always supported and defended by infantry and artillery units on the battlefield. Even when not in combat, repairs were needed often and very time-consuming, and the durability was hampered by the long distances it needed to move. Overall, the Karl Gerät was made vulnerable by enemy weapons that were much cheaper to produce and in greater quantity. Later, in 1942, concerns over the range of the weapon led to modifications. The original version of the machine was called the Karl Gerät 040, and it boasted a 600mm gun. The new, modified version, the Karl Gerät 041, used a 540mm gun. Both the 600mm cannon and the 540mm cannon had similar rates of fire, roughly 1 round every 10 minutes, but had different ammunitions and ranges. The smaller gun had a range of 10 kilometers, over twice as far as the 600mm cannon. The 600mm ammunition was a 2,170 kilogram shell that could pierce through 2.5 meters of concrete at a maximum range of 4.3 kilometers. A lighter shell that weighed 1,700 kilograms could be fired 6.4 kilometers. The 540mm gun fired a smaller 1,250 kilogram shell that could pierce 3.5 meters of concrete. The complicated firing system required a crew of 21, a commander, driver, assistant driver, and 18 gunners. Of the 7 produced, 4 were primarily equipped with the 600mm cannon, and 3 used the 540mm cannon. Each model was capable of being fitted with either weapon. Each Karl Gerät had slight variations from the rest of the vehicles due to the complexity of the design. The first 6 produced were named after Norse deities, and the 7th produced did not have a name. The development of the Karl Gerät was not completed by the time the war broke out in September 1939. The original purpose of the Karl Gerät was no longer relevant by 1940 because Germany intended to bypass the French Maginot Line by attacking through the Low Countries. The Karl Gerät was not ready by the summer of 1940 and did not see action in France. Instead, the Karl Gerät first saw action during the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. Immediately, Army Group Center, one of the organizational divisions of the invading force, had encountered a problem around the Soviet city of Brest, which boasted a large fortress. The infantry and armor were unable to seize the fort, which was situated on an island in a river. A Karl Gerät was called to the front and fired nearly all of its 36 shells on the fortress, but was unable to destroy it due to accuracy issues. Eventually, the fortress was cleared out with the assistance of the Luftwaffe. Next, 3 Karl Geräts were used to attack Sevastopol in Crimea, which was under siege from November 1941 to July 1942. The Karl Geräts took heavy fire from Soviet artillery, and the Germans responded by creating entrenched positions for the siege guns to protect them. The Karl Geräts hit the Soviet coastal defense batteries, but they were quickly repaired and the overall effectiveness of the Karl Gerät was limited. In addition, Karl Geräts were used in the siege of Leningrad from 1941 to early 1944, but failed to make a decisive impact. Soviet artillery made it difficult for Karl Geräts to get in range of the city, and German defeats at Stalingrad led to a cancellation in an offensive on Leningrad. The Karl Gerät saw the most success during the Warsaw Uprising. In August of 1944, as the Soviet forces advanced into Poland, Polish resistance fighters started a revolt to liberate Warsaw from German and possible Soviet occupation. In response, 4 Karl Geräts were used to attack Warsaw during the Warsaw Uprising. The Karl Geräts destroyed numerous Warsaw buildings that the Polish fighters had occupied. During the fighting, Polish sappers discovered a few unexploded rounds and used the explosive charge to create homemade grenades. Finally, in December 1944, 2 were used in the Battle of the Bulge, but were damaged by Allied aircraft. Overall, the Karl Gerät failed to make a decisive impact that the Germans had wanted with the wonder weapon. In fact, they proved to be very expensive and were very vulnerable on the battlefield, especially to enemy aircraft and artillery. One Karl Gerät on its way to bombard Paris in 1944 was blown up after an Allied aircraft bombed its transport train. One was lost in Hungary to the Red Army. Another experienced a burst barrel, rendering it useless. The crew then scrapped the vehicles for extra parts. 3 more vehicles were captured by American forces. As proven by the Karl Gerät, superweapons are often too expensive and vulnerable to be used efficiently and effectively. The awkward nature of the cumbersome machine rendered it vulnerable in combat, and the Karl Gerät's slow speed and inaccurate gun made it a liability for the German military.